Oh, hello, friends. I'm so glad you could join me on this fine evening. In this very mystical episode of Nightmare Tonight, I'm joined by Angie of the fantastic YouTube channel Angie Speaks. Tonight's topics include Mark Fisher's exiting the vampire castle, the nuances of so-called cancel culture, spiritualism, and Jung's notion of the shadow. Be sure to check out Angie Speaks on YouTube. I'll include a link to her channel in the video description. Now, if you appreciate my work and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so for as little as $1 a month on Patreon. As a patron, you'll get your name in the credits of my videos, in addition to weekly updates and early access to new episodes of Nightmare Tonight. Okay, enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to Nightmare Tonight. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Tonight I have with me Angie from Angie Speaks. How's it going?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, well, thanks for joining us. So, if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit about your channel, I think it's something that my listeners would be interested in. So,
Sure, no problem. So I started Angie Speaks about a year ago, and I started because I saw that there was some things that were missing in leftist discourse. I had been following quite a few kind of leftist / left-leaning channels on YouTube and kind of imbibing different political perspectives from the broader left specifically. And I felt like there was a lot of emphasis on material analysis and not enough analysis on how the material intersects with the subjective. So that was kind of the hole I was trying to fill. I was quite inspired by Mark Fisher and, capitalist realism and, a lot of his different essays. And I feel like he is definitely emblematic of somebody who does a really good job of kind of teasing out that intersection between the material and the subjective. He talks about art and culture a lot as pertains to leftist politics. He talks about mental health a lot as pertains to leftist politics. He's also a very kind of keen cultural critic and a Marxist at the same time. And, I really wanted to kind of do something that melded those two passions that I have together, art, pop culture, spirituality, and leftist politics.
yeah, totally. And I just love the eclectic nature of your channel. I love the fact that I never quite know what sort of topic you're going to cover, but I always know that you're going to have a fresh take on it.
Oh, thank you.
So I would highly recommend people check out Angie Speaks. And well, since you mentioned Mark Fisher, you very recently on Halloween put out a video on his essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, which I thought was delightful.
Thank you.
So everyone go watch that. Just pause the podcast and go watch it right now if you haven't already done so. I think it's like 20 minutes long. How long is it?
Yeah, it's about a 20-minute kind of dramatic kind of thing. Yeah.
I love it.
Thank you.
So, the late Mark Fisher wrote this in 2013, this essay, which is a lifetime ago in internet years. I mean, yeah. I don't even remember. It's all a blur to me.
Yeah, same here.
So what does that essay mean to you? And how is it relevant now, 5 years later?
I can't believe it's been 5 years. It does feel like a lifetime in internet years. But I definitely think that in that essay, Mark kind of captured a zeitgeist and he articulated a lot of abstract kind of negative feelings that a lot of people on the left and, from other political persuasions too had been feeling. about the advent of internet mobs and cancel culture. And he did it in a way that wasn't just an admonishment of individuals. It was more of a systemic analysis of why these sorts of phenomenon unfold and why this sort of phenomenon is so prevalent, and corrosive in these modes that we operate in. And he kind of linked it back towards capitalist structures, and he also linked it towards market logic and how we've internalized market logic and how that kind of makes us behave. So he kind of gave us the blueprint to understand how these different forces alter our behavior and prevent solidarity. And yeah, it's a really important essay to me. A lot of people tried to kind of dismiss it because Mark Fisher himself is somebody who's controversial among the liberal left specifically. And exactly because of this essay, a lot of them really didn't like the fact that he criticized cancel culture, because a lot of them see it as their primary tool to achieve social justice. And therefore, any sort of critic of cancel culture is, against social justice, which I absolutely don't think is the case. Mark Fisher was someone who is incredibly pro-social justice and who really did care about, bad people suffering consequences. But oftentimes on these platforms, it's a hunt for catharsis rather than justice. And I think that was what he was trying to put forward in the essay.
Yeah, I think that's on point. And this term, obviously, Fisher did not reference cancel culture directly because the term hadn't been inserted into the zeitgeist quite yet. But this is something, previously might have been referred to as call-out culture. It's now more commonly referred to as cancel culture. I think that's it's a bit of a dubious term to me, but nonetheless, I think we should reference it just because that is the common usage, and that is what people understand it as generally.
Yeah. It's definitely not a culture. I wouldn't necessarily call it a culture, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it was something that was unique to the internet either, or even unique to leftists,
right?
In that sense. But the way that it manifests in internet culture, and the way that it manifests in internet cultures that are specifically focused on social justice issues, is incredibly pernicious. And I think that's worth unpicking and investigating.
Totally. So you yourself have had some direct personal experience with cancel culture. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. It's something that was incredibly traumatic. And it occurred when I was a fairly new creator. I had only been making videos then for about 4 or 5 months. And, or probably even less. I have to think about it. It happened in February of last year. So yeah, I hadn't been making videos for February of this year. So I hadn't really been making videos for very long at the time. And it was a terrible, terrible experience, one that I'm sort of still mentally recovering from. And, it was the thing that woke me up to how the machine operates. I guess before having this experience, I was going through somewhat of a honeymoon period as a creator. I was like, oh, you just kind of get to put out these videos and then you make lots of new friends and, everything's happy and hunky dory. I hadn't really been privy to things like the algorithm, or didn't really have a full understanding of social capital or how it worked. I didn't really know much, and this really traumatic event kind of opened my eyes to a plethora of different forms of theory to kind of explain what was going on and how these different internet cultures sort of structure themselves. So yeah, it was a really horrible incident. It was based on hearsay and tangential connections. Somebody who was a patron of mine, and at the time I had like over 150 patrons, and I don't know all of my patrons personally, and I never really have known them personally.
How could you?
Even the one, Huh?
And how could you know them personally?
I know. I don't know how I could. I have a Discord for my patrons, but I only interact in there on like a occasional basis, and it's usually to promote whatever it is that I'm doing, and it's kind of more of a free space for them to do what they want and interact with each other based on the topics that I discuss and all of those things. But yeah, a patron of mine was accused of something heinous 10 years ago. And because I didn't disavow them immediately when people started to attack me for it, for them, me having them as my patron, I was then public enemy number one. People started to make all kinds of horrible assumptions about my character. They were spreading all kinds of horrible rumors about me around, making these awful videos. There were entire channels that were like dedicated to smearing me, all based on the fact that somebody who was accused of something a really long time ago basically was my patron, and I didn't admonish them. I didn't act in a punitive fashion because I didn't know all the facts, and I was expected to cancel or be cancelled. And I had like a moral qualm with disposing of somebody without knowing all the facts of a situation just because I wanted to get people off my back. That's the kind of
rightfully so, I would say.
Yeah, that's the kind of pressure that this sort of vampire castle puts on you. They put you under psychological abuse pressure to bow to what they want or be harassed and smeared. I was doxxed as well. I was hacked. I was getting messages from people threatening to come to my house. Yeah, it was really, really, or it was a psychological ordeal, and a lot of it was coming from the left. I've never had any run-in with fascists. The majority of the like heinous stuff that I've suffered since I've been an internet personality has been from other leftists, and it's always based around whether I'm pure enough, whether I'm a good enough representative. Again, representation is kind of what these people want. They want, perfect representation, and they want to put the burden of perfect representation on public figures. And if the public figures are shown to be beyond reproach in any way, it's as if they take like this sort of perverse pleasure in tearing them down in a really awful way. And yeah, it's a really big problem and it's not just kind of like I said, unique situation to internet leftism. It happens in leftist real life spaces as well. It was also a tactic that the CIA and other law enforcement agencies that wanted to subvert leftist movements used this sort of prototype of cancel culture back in the day to subvert and destroy leftist groups. They would have informants, they would plant evidence, they would also spread false allegations and rumors against people. And yeah, it's really really corrosive. It's not a good thing at all. It's scary, very scary.
Yeah, and I've heard the as the old saying goes, with friends like these, who needs COINTELPRO?
Yep. It is. We are definitely we are our own cops in that regard. Like, it's really, really terrifying. We don't need any outside subversion. It seems as if we're doing a brilliant job of it ourselves.
And I want to let that sink in for listeners. The fact that the entirety of this behavior directed towards you was from people who call themselves leftists. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, I just want to do some armchair psychoanalysis.
No problem. No problem. That's my favorite kind of psychoanalysis.
So, if I'm understanding this correctly, and I want to be specific with the criticism I'm talking about. So I'm specifically referring to people who engage in doxing, people who threaten to come to your house, death threats, and this sort of guilt by association mentality.
Yeah,
I'm specifically referring to this behavior when I say this is perverted. in the Zizekian sense. Like these are perverts, because they know what they're doing is antithetical to the movement they supposedly espouse, to the goals they supposedly get behind. And nonetheless, they do it anyway because they get off on it. It's a power trip.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's also linked to, I think for some people, it is a perverse kind of twisted, desire for this sort of dark catharsis. But I also think that it's a systemic thing too. I think that the system pushes people towards this kind of behavior. Even there are obviously people who cynically will kind of operate in this way, and then there are those who are just sort of following the incentives of the system, because along with every canceling or call out comes the ability to take social capital for oneself, or to amass social capital for the incident. So there are some people who want to amass social capital for themselves. There are others who just want to appear correct and as if they're on the right side of an issue. So even if they don't know the facts, even if they don't know what's going on, they will still disavow somebody and tarnish their reputation because they want to be seen as right. And during the incident that occurred, there were quite a few YouTubers, like actual YouTubers with followings, people in the left tube scene, if you want to say, who did come out and completely admonish me and disavow me. People who I had never even spoken to before, people who I had never even as much as traded words with, decided that they were going to make all these aspersions about my character based on nothing but hearsay. And that was when I kind of realized that there's a culture here, and there are also like incentives. If you make a thread about something controversial, it's more likely to get attention than you just kind of talking about your interests. I see this at play all the time. I mean, when ContraPoints had her canceling situation occur, I tweeted something out, in solidarity with her, because I know she had been getting a lot of heat for it. I wasn't specifically talking about the issue at hand, because I didn't know enough about it to take a side, but I am going to stand with anyone who's being harassed, no matter what. And I tweeted that out, and it got like nearly 3,000 likes or something in terms of engagement. Whereas if I tweet, "Oh, hey guys, here's my new video," the most I'll get on like a new video is maybe like 500 to like 300 likes or something like that. So there's this incentive for controversy. There's this incentive for drama. The algorithm is constantly demanding new sacrifices. So there's an incentive as well for bad faith in order to just kind of trudge up tragedy and drama for people to sort of gawk at, and for people to kind of maximize the ability to gain social capital from. Same thing, another incident, I had a bit of a public spat with Destiny about, I don't remember, like a couple months ago. And I wasn't looking to start drama. I wasn't looking to, do anything crazy or whatever. But it got pretty heated, and I noticed almost immediately that my Twitter follow count jumped up about 400. So yeah, there are systemic incentives for this sort of thing. And there are systemic incentives for bad faith people to use drama and to use hostility and to use psychological abuse, basically, as a tool to amass social capital for themselves. And yeah, that's the reason why it happens. And also, especially when it's linked to social justice. Social justice is something that gets a lot of attention, and performing social justice is also a way to kind of get cultural capital as somebody who is pious and who cares about the plight of the marginalized and who is a quote unquote good person. So performing goodness, performing solidarity in that way is another way of kind of gaining social capital and prominence in certain spaces. And just because one is able to perform it doesn't mean that it's actually genuine. And yeah, all of this is just kind of amalgamated into this sort of toxic sludge of leftist media, kind of internet-oriented leftism that has this incredibly corrosive phenomenon slash force working underneath it. And I think that that's exactly what Mark Fisher was talking about when he was talking about the vampire castle.
Yeah, I think it's important to put it in systemic terms in the way that you're describing. And I mean, I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a galaxy brain take, but is there a way for the left to weaponize these dynamics without eating ourselves, without, being counterproductive for our own movement?
I don't know. It's something I lose sleep over. I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're talking about reverse engineering this sort of mob mentality into something useful, I don't know if that's really possible on these capitalist social media platforms. We don't own them; they own us. They colonize our leisure time. We are not in control of how these incentives are put forward. We're not in control of the algorithms. We're not in control of what gets attention. So all we can do is either not participate or play ball. And there are some people who are really good at kind of engineering the attention economy and kind of moving it towards better aims, but it's incredibly difficult to do. And then there are people who just kind of do their work and hope that people will resonate with it. And that's kind of what I've been trying to do, just kind of doing my work and hoping that people would resonate with it. But in terms of manipulating the attention economy and really kind of trying to bend these sorts of incentives in a way that benefits our message, it's very difficult because these sorts of incentives are quite counterproductive to our message as leftists. Things like high drama, things like hot takes, quote unquote. Our kind of political framework needs well thought out dialogue and a healthy discourse. And it's very difficult to do that more than ever on these platforms, especially as YouTube starts to kind of move away from things like the traditional video essay towards and encourages things like live streaming, Twitter's like low word count. It's all stuff that kind of pushes you towards punchy hot takes, drama, hostility. And it's because that's what has the most eyeballs on it. Unfortunately, that's what gets the most attention.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And the major concern here, I guess, is we end up reifying the same system that we're trying to dismantle, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because I feel like bread tube, quote unquote, which is kind of what people have been calling left tube, is like the recuperated version of leftist on the internet. Yeah, and especially those who create our sort of content but don't actually question the systemic um, incentives around it. I feel like it's just kind of recuperated leftist politics. Those who kind of just follow the incentives and follow the business model down the rabbit hole of YouTube or Twitter without actually being mindful about how it can be corrosive to the discourse, how it can be corrosive to our political aims. You are kind of seeing like a recuperation occurring. I think that YouTube and Twitter and all these major platforms are good in terms of being able to have reach to wide amount of people. You're not really going to be able to find that anywhere else, unfortunately, because these companies do have a monopoly on, the collective unconscious, I guess, if you want to say that. They have a monopoly on our ability to kind of communicate widely. And as leftists, we want to do that. We don't want to sort of shut ourselves off into little country clubs and enclaves. But I think we have to be realistic about what these tools are. These tools can be used to radicalize people. They can be used to spread class consciousness as well. But they're not really tools that can be used to organize and create solidarity in the way that people have been trying to. I mean, one of the lies of neoliberalism, one of the major lies of neoliberalism, is that neoliberalism basically tries to present market solutions to social problems. And I feel like that's kind of the trick that's going on here with leftist politics. We've been sold the idea that these quote unquote consumer demographics are actual communities when they're not. I don't think that leftists online could consider themselves a community. They're a demographic of consumers that like to consume leftist content. And there's a very different relationship you have as a consumer than you would as a community. And this is just another way that capitalism sort of atomizes us and confuses our relationships and kind of moves us into the realm of consumption and outside of the realm of actually being and doing.
Yeah. I'm just over here nodding silently to everything you're saying. I completely agree. And I guess the best that we can do is, like you said, sort of keep our heads down and do our work, and the important work of consciousness raising, which I think you do a great job of with your channel.
Thank you.
So,
thank you so much.
Pivoting from that topic, a few months ago, you put out a video about spirituality, which has this wonderful sort of Twin Peaks aesthetic.
Yeah, I love Twin Peaks so much.
Yeah, me too. I can't wait for it. So, there's rumors that it's going to come back. I'm just like,
it better. Because the return was not enough for me to satiate my Twin Peaks hunger. I need more.
I do too.
I need to know. I need to know more.
But so that video you did was about spirituality.
Yeah.
What does spirituality mean to you? And what role does it play in your life? And how can spirituality have a place in contemporary leftist movements?
Yeah, great question. This is one that I was actually looking forward to the most. So that video that I made was specifically about how capitalism recuperates spirituality. And I used Twin Peaks as kind of a metaphor as the Black Lodge kind of representing market recuperation. And in that kind of video, Angie is trapped in the Black Lodge with like a New Age doppelganger, and the New Age doppelganger kind of represents recuperated kind of capitalist spirituality. And by breaking out of the Black Lodge, she then realizes that spirituality is about being and not having the appearance of. And I think it kind of ties into what I was saying before. For me, capitalism and our current kind of neoliberal mode takes us out of, it takes us away from the essence of life, and it presents us with images. And it's worse now than it ever has been, in my opinion. The way that we're kind of losing touch with the essence of life, not just out externally, but also our internal reality too, and our ability to sort of self-actualize in that sense. Capitalism and neoliberalism, they present us with this world of images, this world of, aesthetic, this world of, it's like a fake kind of mirror world that like kind of presents us with the ideal, that's this sort of untangible ideal. And it kind of distracts us away from, being, and convinces us that having is the key to actualization. And spirituality for me is the thing that kind of puts me back in touch with the essence of being and the essence of life. And I think that that's an incredibly revolutionary thing, moving away from having and moving towards being, moving away from these weird abstract false realities that we're constantly being confronted with, whether that be on these social media platforms or whatever, and moving towards actually connecting with the world and people. This is kind of what spirituality means to me in an abstract sense. It's something that puts me in touch not only with my inner reality, but with the world and with other people. I guess if you are talking about my paradigm, I guess I would call myself like a Jungian pagan, but I'm largely agnostic. Most people who are into spirituality these days are largely kind of agnostic people. But I do find a lot of power in working with certain archetypes because I see these archetypes as representative of things that already exist within me. So depending on what situation that I'm in, if I'm, in some heated situation, I might decide I'm going to work with a warrior goddess. And, or if I, am having issues with my love life, I'll go and summon Aphrodite. But these are things that I believe already exist within me. And it's something that has given me a lot of power and like trajectory and knowledge and self-understanding. It's not for everybody, of course. Like, it's not like something that everybody is going to resonate with. I think I'm already a little bit insane, which is probably why I think that's probably why I'm a theatrical person.
Yeah.
In that sense, which is probably why, and I'm not easily weirded out by being weird when I'm on my own. So it's something that resonates with me. Ritual magic is also something that I also participate in when I can. That's another very kind of psycho-spiritual experience that has a lot to do with, transformative theatrical experiences. It's like very Jungian, very psychological stuff. And then also group ritual. There's nothing like transpersonal experience of being with people and doing ritual with people. There's something incredibly transformative and community affirming about that as well, life affirming. And I mean, ritual used to be something that was part of human life a lot more. And I feel like as our common spaces are continuously eroded and colonized by capital, as our personal time is colonized and eroded by capital, as our ability to kind of gather with other people, ritual has kind of dissipated. And I think there's something incredibly powerful about ritual. I've been standing Ari Aster's Midsummer for a really long time.
Hell yeah.
Ever since because I think that it has a lot to say about ritual and community. You have the main character of that movie who is somebody who is bereaved, somebody who is atomized, somebody who is, in this sort of, when we meet her in the film, she's sort of stuck in this sort of cold modern world without many tangible friendships. I mean, the only friend that she really has is someone who she talks to on the phone. And then they go to the Swedish cult, and she's confronted with this community of people, and they have all these different rituals and affects and ways of showing togetherness and ways of showing empathy. And I think that the horror aspect of it also shows the Western aversion to anything pagan, or the Western aversion to ritual, and even the way that the guys of the group, they see it they kind of have they have like the affect of like the cold kind of anthropological gaze.
Right.
They're not really participating in the way that she participates in the rituals, and she participates in their culture, because there is a Western aversion to anything that's seen as irrational, anything that's seen as psychological, anything that's seen as spiritual, anything that's seen as pagan or occult, because it's not just because of Christianity, but also because it goes against the orthodoxy of rationalism. And I don't think that having a spiritual practice or paradigm necessarily puts you at odds with science or, rationality or logic or reason. I think that I think the space in between logic and chaos is where magic truly happens. That's kind of the paradigm that I'm within. That kind of space in between. There has to be space for intuition. I mean, any scientist who's made a massive discovery, their intuition definitely plays a huge role in that. The intuitive and the logical are two areas that I don't necessarily see at odds with each other. I think that true magic happens when they're built together. And yeah, I definitely do see that there is space for chaos, that there is space for irrationality, and there is space for for the wild and the chaotic, because really and truly, like, our unconscious mind is wild and chaotic. Our unconscious mind is a place where, logic and reason aren't really, tools that can be used to navigate it that well, even though we try. And that's where a lot of the magic in culture comes from, this kind of strange unconscious part of ourselves. And, magic definitely is something that puts me in touch with that layer of reality.
I love it. And I think this bears out in scientific evidence as well. Not with, of course, not with respect to any kind of supernatural claim, but with respect to the underlying validity of our intuitions and our so-called gut feelings. More and more scientific evidence is coming out showing that our gut feelings are tools that we can use to help navigate life, right?
Definitely. And I mean, in terms of, there's a lot of science around, the phenomenon of intuition. There's a school of thought that kind of espouses that intuition is kind of an extension of our mammalian instinct. As obviously as animals have certain instincts about, like, when there's going to be some kind of terrible weather, you see them, so there's this kind of idea that intuition is kind of an extension of our mammalian instinct. There are definitely studies that are being done about how intuition works. And yeah, it's something that I'm definitely excited about, because I do any sort of, especially with the artistic process, that's kind of the one place where I see this proven all the time. It always starts with something irrational, illogic, intuitive, and then you use your logical faculties to translate that inkling, that strange feeling, into something that's coherent. And I feel like so much of culture, art, and even science kind of begins from that weird primordial place of nonsense. This is something that the Dadaists really kind of tapped into. And, they were incredibly interested in using art to express the intuitive faculties without necessarily distilling it into something that isn't abstract, which I kind of admire. And, there are some people who believe that there's some kind of supernatural element to our internal faculty. I'm totally agnostic about it. I don't really know, but it's fun and it's good crack. It keeps me grounded. It keeps me entertained, and I've learned, like, a lot about myself, a lot about my the world, a lot about other people through kind of opening myself up to certain spiritual ideas. But it's not, like I say, you be open-minded, but don't be so open-minded that your brain falls out. Like,
right. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, you have to filter everything through your own perception. I kind of, in my sense, I am skeptical about most things until I try them and I see what works for me. And I try also not to let, like, skepticism turn into cynicism, because that can all sometimes happen, because I don't want it to block me from actually having experiences. I want my skepticism to serve to protect me from bullshit and to keep me tethered to reality, but I also don't want it to stop me from actually having experiences. And it's a weird place to balance, I guess. It's a weird balance to have. But it's an interesting one, and it's one that's definitely added a lot of richness and, like, fulfillment to my life.
That's awesome. And I'm just curious, do you practice meditation?
Yeah, I do. I meditate every day. And it's something that's definitely helps me with mental health. I suffer from anxiety and depression, and meditation is something that allowed me to observe my own thoughts. Um, and that then kind of gave me power over them. One of the things that I struggle with the most is intrusive thoughts. That's something that I've had a lot of issues with, suffering from, like, pure OCD. and struggling with intrusive thoughts. And one of the things that meditation helps me do is realize that like thoughts are kind of like breathing. You don't choose what comes into your head. It's a phenomenon that just kind of happens on its own. The brain is kind of a computer that's constantly taking in all this different information and trying to find what to do with it. And when you meditate, you slow down your conscious mind enough to actually observe what's going on. So rather than having it be this constant assault that comes towards you, you're kind of in an observing position of the phenomenon that's happening inwardly. And it definitely helps me with my mental health, and gave me a new perspective about my mind and how my mind works. And it's also incredibly healthy, and expansive exercise to do as well. I'm a big David Lynch fan, as we talked about Tim Peaks a minute ago. David Lynch is somebody who definitely espouses meditation a lot. He's a very big proponent of meditation, and as a daily practice. And it takes a time. It takes a lot. It takes time to get comfortable doing it because I'm quite a fidgety person. But it took me about 21 days to get to the point where it had become a habit. So yeah, meditation is something that I practice quite a bit. But the thing that I'm most adept at is the tarot. And the way that I use the tarot is more in a Jungian way, not in kind of I'm going to tell the future way. It's a Jungian way. It's kind of a Jungian exercise where the tarot kind of is a library of images and archetypes. And you then use those images and archetypes to kind of find out what's going on within your own internal terrain. Or when you become more adept at it, you can find out kind of what's going on in the terrain of another person. So it's kind of an inward reflecting exercise rather than a I'm going to tell my future type of exercise. So yeah, the tarot is another thing that I'm really big on as well.
That's cool, and really fascinating. I would like to learn more about that. So maybe I'll tune in to one of your tarot sessions next time you do it.
That'd be awesome. And feel free to hit me up and ask a question if you like. I do read tarot for I've become sort of like the woods witch of the left.
I love it.
People do come to me with their queries, so feel free.
Yeah, I might take you up on that. I need to meditate more, definitely. But I was on a good run there for a while, and like you said, it's really about observing your thoughts, and sometimes you can notice patterns, right? I noticed that over around about a course of a month of just meditating for 10 minutes a day, I started to notice how negative my thoughts were sometimes. Once you're able to call attention to that, then you can, in the course of everyday life, be like, oh, I'm thinking negative again. That's something I do, and I don't really, I don't have to do this. I can change the course of my thoughts right now because I've noticed it.
Exactly. And the thing is, the modern kind of, because people forget the power of consciousness. And to me, consciousness is like where magic happens. It doesn't happen like in the physical world, it happens within you. And, consciousness is something that shifts. You're not always in the same mode of consciousness, which is another thing that meditation taught me. When you're out and about running around London, like I was today, I'm in a very kind of manic, crazy kind of like rush consciousness. When I'm like, chilling on the couch with my boyfriend, I'm in a different frame of consciousness. When I'm painting a painting, I'm in a different kind of consciousness, like more of a flow state. Your consciousness changes, but we're not trained to learn how to manipulate our consciousness on our own. We just kind of allow our consciousness to happen to us. Whereas when you meditate, it puts you in a seat of power over your consciousness, and you're able to sort of call different states up yourself. And yeah, it's the same thing with noticing thought patterns. I definitely noticed that a lot of my thoughts were anxious. And you have to quiet down the monkey mind enough to be able to really observe what's going on. if you're in this sort of manic state of consciousness all the time, or you're in a mundane kind of consciousness all the time, it's difficult for you to kind of get in touch with those different aspects and observe them from an objective perspective, definitely. And yeah, I think meditation is something that it's not easy to get into, but I did it for 21 days. I made like a contract with myself that I was going to do it for 21 days. And after that 21 days, it kind of just became a habit. Um, and yeah, there are all kinds of aspects to meditation, like obviously being able to alter your consciousness, being able to notice your thought patterns and alter them. And the most important for me is learning to be present, because part of getting into that state is not, and it's difficult to do that in this modern world, not be overly focused on the future and worrying about it, or focused on the past. Like being in the present moment is something that you rarely get to do. And taking that 10-20 minutes a day to just be, again, like spirituality is literally being. That's all it boils down to. When you're in the moment and you really tap into that mindfulness in the moment, there's almost this bliss that one experiences. But it's difficult to get there because of how our consciousness is currently conditioned. But it's possible. It just takes practice and dedication. A lot of people get frustrated with meditation because they don't achieve those results right away. But it's the same thing as like trying to do a painting and then getting frustrated because you didn't, paint the Sistine Chapel immediately.
Right.
You have to, you need to actually stretch those muscles and build them.
Exactly.
And it's something that's healthy and good. But, unfortunately, we live under capitalism and we're all stretched thin, and not everybody has a lot of time. And that's kind of one of the things that pisses me off about, the liberals that espouse meditation as a cure to the alienation that we experience under capitalism.
Yep.
It's not a cure for sure. It's a cope, definitely. It's a way of coping, and it also helps you, actualize in that sense. But it's definitely the cure is a systemic one.
Exactly.
And that's where our attention should be focused. But yeah, meditation is something that I definitely heavily recommend.
Sam Harris is one of those guys that came to mind when you said, liberals that sort of are really into meditation. And I know from experience, all of this stuff with respect to spirituality, I would have winced at, 5 years ago because I was in my my dreaded new atheist phase.
Oh yeah, I went through that with you. I was there with you. I was right there with you. But I don't regret it. I don't regret my atheist phase because I needed that.
Right.
I believe in, I kind of see it in kind of the way that chaos magicians see it. I believe in belief as a tool and like paradigm shifts. And I went through massive paradigm shifts throughout my life. I was raised as like an evangelical Christian in a very kind of devout home in that sense. And I needed my new atheist phase to purge me of all of that kind of indoctrination, so that I could then go on and develop a more healthier and robust understanding of spirituality. Without that, I don't think I could have a comfortable spiritual practice today without having first gone through my intense atheist phase. So even though it was a little cringy, I needed it to get to where I am now. And I feel like there are probably a lot of people who can resonate with like needing that to deprogram themselves from a strict religious upbringing.
Yeah, and I just find it strange how many leftists went through a new atheist phase. It seems to be a pattern.
I mean, you definitely see a lot of the residual cultural affects from the new atheist scene back in the day kind of making their way into leftist spaces. The whole kind of debate culture and the dick measuring of
Yep.
who's the most logical, big-brained, person. There's a lot of that kind of, and there's also a fetishization of logic and reason as well. And as somebody who, and in spiritual terms, logic is kind of, and reason is kind of like the yang energy, and then unreason and chaos is kind of the yin energy. But chaos is the thing that contains all potential, in my opinion. Especially, that's kind of why it's been, in spiritual terms, characterized as feminine, because it's kind of the container or the womb of all potential. And I feel like when we cut ourselves off from that chaotic energy, we cut ourselves off from the nonsense, we're cutting ourselves off from the subjective. And so much of the human experience, psychologically and spiritually, is kind of contained within the realm of that subjectivity. And it's also why I'm really passionate about Dadaism, because the Dadaists understood this. And I feel like a lot of people fetishize, the yang, the masculine kind of principle of logic and reason and order and all of those things. And I think it's residual kind of baggage from the Western kind of paradigm that we are all kind of indoctrinated with. Whereas other cultures also have a bit more reverence for the yin, the feminine principle, and they find ways of kind of incorporating that into their culture, their politics, and their discourse.
That's a good way of putting it. And I'm curious to get your thoughts, because I know Dr. Jordan Peterson is really into Jungian psychology. So this line of thought is, of course, not immune to reactionary appropriation, or whatever you would call it. So I'm just curious if you've read any of his work specifically with respect to Jungian psychology, and what your take on it is.
Well, that's the thing about Peterson, is he tries to imbue Jungian analysis with this sort of blind deference to the status quo. He tries to use Jungian ideas to justify the status quo. And unfortunately, there are a lot of leftists who think that anything spiritual or occult or Jungian is inherently reactionary. And I would say to them, why would we want to surrender the territory of the subjective to the right wing? We should be claiming that territory. I've made a video about Jordan Peterson and this very subject on my channel. One of the major issues with the left is because we have surrendered the subjective, we have surrendered that territory. The right wing are using it to radicalize, to spread really toxic messages. Most people don't respond to rationality. Most people don't respond to reason. They respond to gut feelings. They respond to resonating with higher ideals. They respond to the subjective. And this is something that the right wing has been able to use to its advantage. Whereas we fetishize logic, we fetishize reason to the point where we become alienated from what actually resonates with people's humanity. And I mean, one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson has become so popular is because he is speaking to these subjective needs of the people who are his audience, mostly alienated young white men. He's not beating them over the head with logic and material analysis. He's talking to them about their internal terrain, their personal development, and their self-actualization. And we have surrendered that territory completely and allowed them to use these ideas to justify the status quo. I don't think that Jung was reactionary. From what I've studied of Jung anyway, he was not reactionary. I think that Jungian ideas were incredibly revolutionary for the time specifically. And I definitely think that there's a lot to be built upon from his ideas as well. A lot more that we can do now to build upon them in the 21st century. And I don't think that the likes of Jordan Peterson should be the ones, in the spotlight in that term. I don't think that we should constantly cede territory as soon as something becomes problematic. because then we're not going to be left with any territory. And that just kind of seems to be what the left loves to do.
That, again, I'm just nodding vigorously over here. I agree completely. And this touches on something else I wanted to ask you. So, like you said, you dabble in tarot and other activities that, some smart boys, people who fetishize logic and reason might condescendingly refer to as, woo-woo.
Yeah.
So, like, with this in mind, there's been a bit of a kerfuffle on Twitter. Like, this happened at this point, I think it was like a couple weeks ago. Some on the left were linking astrology to fascism, which, I'll just say up front, I think that's kind of silly. I don't think you're going to cancel astrology because there's too many normies who love it, right? There's too many people who find it. I used to be one of these people who like fetishized reason to the extent that I would, watch debates and just take notes, which, there's some merit to that in its own right.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with, like, logic and reason. I mean, that's a very massive part of what like structures the world in reality. But there's also an underside to that, the subjective, the chaotic, the intuitive. I think that those things also have merit, but they just kind of get pushed to the side.
Totally. And I also think it's important, like going into things with the right intentions is important. And I don't really think I had the right intentions when I was in this phase of my life. I think I just wanted to prove myself, So, but like back on this astrology thing, it does seem to me like there's a concerted effort to really paint any kind of mysticism, spiritualism as pernicious in some way in certain areas on the left. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like it's again heavily misguided. The same thing happened with punk in the 70s, where people were like, oh, there are some punks that are fascists, therefore anybody who wears anything punk or uses any sort of punk iconography or fashion is also cancelled, is also a fascist. I think that this is dumb. Like we're continuously surrendering territory.
Yep.
And like we're continuously ceding cultural territory to the right. As for astrology is something that's a lot of fun. It's, for me anyway, a lot of fun. I don't necessarily see it as something supernatural, but it's definitely something that makes you reflect on yourself, on aspects of yourself, on your personality, if done properly. There are loads of different forms of astrology too. There's like the kind of woo-woo version of astrology, the kind of recuperated, like liberal version of astrology. And then there are the kind of psychological models of astrology that can really make you reflect on yourself. It's just kind of a fun exercise. And it's not for everybody, but if somebody wants to dabble in astrology, I don't see why that's an issue. The thing that makes me the most kind of annoyed is that if somebody is attracted to some area of mysticism or this or that, people automatically make assumptions about their intelligence. People automatically make assumptions about their value as a person. And there's a lot of sexism and racism kind of attached to that. There's a very kind of Western kind of centric attitude that's like kind of attached to that kind of admonishment. And I think it's really unfortunate because that might be something that is enriching someone's life in a way that you may not understand. I see art as magic. I see watching a film as a form of ritual. These are things that alter one's consciousness and act as a mirror into one's soul. I see tarot as an art. I see astrology as an art. And I think that they have the same kind of transformative potential as any other form of art. And when I say transformative, that could mean societally or internally in terms of you, yourself, whatever. These are different forms of art that have different forms of meaning for different people. And I think it's very upsetting when people cast, aspersions, make harsh judgments, about people's intelligence or character because they're attracted to the psycho-spiritual. I think it's really disgusting. And I also think it's really harmful that the left is like so quick to surrender territory, because there's this sort of holier than thou attitude. And it's very, very, that's what I think is more than somebody just, playing with some tarot cards. The other kind of thing is pernicious. But just out of curiosity, David, what's your sign?
Oh, well, it's funny that you ask because it's my understanding, and I'm obviously not like super well versed in astrology. I think in most schools of thought, it's a Gemini, but like I said, I'm not super well versed in astrology. Yeah.
I feel because Gemini isn't. You know what's been the most useful for astrology for me? Because I'll explain. So Gemini is an air sign, and I'm also an air sign. So I'm an Aquarius, and air in the tarot, also in astrology, air is the suit of like the mind and communication. So like learning what your elemental affiliation is can be a way of you learning about aspects of yourself and kind of building confidence based on those aspects of yourself. I kind of see it as like unlocking your superpower. So being an air sign, it makes sense that you would have a YouTube channel and that we would be having this amazing discussion because air is all about ideas, the mind, communication, and we tend to be the sort of people who are attracted to that kind of thing to begin with. And yeah, learning about, what Aquarius means for me, learning the fact that I was an air sign as well, that was something that resonated with me. It doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone else, but it resonated with me and gave me a lot of confidence about the areas of my life that give me power almost and give me purpose and meaning and all kinds of things. So there are all these like little interesting tidbits that you can unlock from engaging with these forms of art and, really allowing them to unlock aspects of your psychology. Um, but then again, yeah, it's not forever. For some people, that might be, going to the therapist. For some
Right.
people, that might be going for a run. For some people, that might be, doing a painting of something abstract that they then decode later. It really is up to you. But for some people, mysticism, these sort of mystic tools are like readily available tools that have been used for time in memoriam to kind of unlock and explain aspects of your psychology. And that resonates with some people and it doesn't resonate with some people. And that's fine, to each his own.
Yeah, and I think it is worth keeping in mind. Obviously, if I know you are familiar with fascism.
Yeah.
It's worth keeping in mind that there is a mystical element of fascism. So
Yes.
there is a dark side to this, and it is something we need to be on the lookout for. But at the same,
I have a video about esoteric fascism.
right? Yeah, I remember that now.
Yeah, definitely. But that's because the fascists, again, they don't give a shit about fetishizing logic and reason. They don't care about what's right. They care about what works.
Yep.
And occultism, spirituality, the knowledge of symbols and signs, the knowledge of archetypes and stories, monomyths, all of these things are the building blocks of culture.
Yep.
And a lot of these fascist movements were attempting to build a new culture. And they used a lot of these occult principles, not only to kind of tap into the unconscious of the people they were trying to control, but to create a new kind of mythic culture. And as woo as it seems, it's a powerful thing. because culture is story, culture is myth, culture is image, culture is all of these different things. These are the components that make culture. And the reason why they have such an impact is because they understand these principles. And it really upsets me that the left is surrendering this tool, surrendering this territory of myth building, of culture building, of understanding how to use art as a tool to manipulate consciousness. It's it's a shame. It's a big shame.
I kind of feel the same way about Joker, the movie that recently came out.
Yeah.
Some on the left, obviously due to the sort of reactionary ethos that Joker sometimes espouses in terms of its like cultural position. Like, for instance, a lot of like reactionary people use the Joker as a meme, right? So due to that association, they just assumed that the movie was going to be espousing this reactionary ethos. And I mean, that's not my interpretation of the film at all, but it just goes to show you it's yet another very important cultural signifier. I know it sounds silly to say that the Joker is an important thing in the cultural zeitgeist, but it is. It
is.
Right. And
he's a symbol. He's an archetype and an important one.
Yep.
He's one that I have on my altar, at the moment. Like he is, and he's emerged in our zeitgeist for a reason. He has emerged out of the primordial sludge of the collective unconscious for a reason, and that's something that spiritually minded leftists should be paying attention to. There's a reason that this archetype has emerged, this kind of he's almost like a trickster god or a chaos deity. And that's something that the right has been able to use to its advantage time in memoriam, but something that we still struggle to use. We fetishize logic so much. And I think it's ironic that the Joker is kind of the embodiment of that chaos that we desperately need to break into the zeitgeist in the way that we want to. I find it really ironic that the admonishment and the treatment of this film represent the left's fear of that chaotic energy because we fetishize logic so much. I think that there's this sort of innate fear of that form of archetype within the left. I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people who sort of claim to be on the left were very quick to jump in the seat of judgment over this film. But yeah, I definitely think that we need to stop ceding territory, and we need to stop making knee-jerk judgment reactions on what's fashy and what's not fashy. We should be reverse engineering these things to suit our aims. I loved the new Joker film. I thought it was a really interesting piece. And mainly because it's quite obvious that the creators of the film themselves are not leftists.
Yep.
But they tapped into something in the collective unconscious that emerged through this film. It was kind of an amalgamation of like the shitty like Hollywood superhero industrial complex met with elements of the zeitgeist that were kind of bubbling within the collective unconscious that like birthed this film. It kind of came out of that primordial ooze. And I think a lot of the themes and the messages that came through weren't even necessarily deliberate. It came from this intuitive, chaotic mixture. And that's the place where magic truly happens. So yeah, there was something sublime about the way that this film emerged the way it did.
Just sort of tying everything we've talked about together, this the commonality here, like with cancel culture, people trying to, people fetishizing logic and trying to cancel spirituality, people trying to cancel astrology. Obviously, all of these things there's a place for good faith criticism of everything, right?
Yeah.
But it seems to me that the recurring theme here is just this like black and white mentality. Either, you're guilty or you're innocent. Either you're marginalized or you're privileged. Either
Yep.
you're canceled or you are a queen, and
Yep.
we're gonna stan you. And it's just this black and white mentality.
One of the most interesting concepts to me from Jung, and the one that's been the most transformative to me, and the one that I feel like applies the most in this specific situation, is the concept of the shadow, you know? And the shadow kind of consists of everything about ourselves that we try to repress. So, for example, on the surface, the persona could see itself as a good, noble person. But because one fails to acknowledge the negative attitudes and behavior that one has, the shadow grows and it strengthens and it becomes to kind of, it starts to sort of consume the persona. And I feel like that's kind of what's happening with, I wouldn't necessarily say the left because the left is anti-capitalist, but people who are concerned with social justice, let's say. There's this idea that because I'm concerned with social justice, that means I am good. That means I am right. That means I am an ally. That means that I am on the side of good and that everybody else is on the side of bad. And when you convince yourself that you are good, you do more bad, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Acknowledging the shadow is what prevents you from being pathological and acting in pathological ways. According to Jung and according to me as well, I believe that. I understand that I'm a mixture of good and evil, as most human beings are. I try to be good. I guess in some aspects of my personality, I am good. But I also acknowledge that, I have a power. I also am selfish sometimes. I can also be very cruel. I am also, I can be, self-interested. I can also be incredibly dismissive of others' emotions. There are all kinds of elements of myself that I know are not necessarily, number one, socially acceptable or even pro-social behaviors. There are certain very anti-social behaviors that I also have lingering underneath the surface. But if I just kind of was like, I'm a good person, and didn't try to reckon with or understand my shadow, then those shadow behaviors would emerge and I would just be trying to justify them. And I feel like that's what the left does. The left doesn't look at its shadow. And I think cancel culture is a massive part of the left's shadow. And it comes from the will to be right, the will to be perpetually correct, the will to have power over people, the will to be able to condemn other people. These are elements of the shadow of the left. But because we've convinced ourselves that we're good, we don't see the need to do the shadow work and actually look at who we are beneath the surface. And yeah, it's gonna crush us unless we work to do the work to unravel some of these.
Yep. And, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I had a really great discussion.
You always have just such a refreshing take on everything. So, again, I want to encourage listeners to go to Angie Speaks on YouTube and check out her stuff if you haven't already done so. So we're going to leave it there. So have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, David. I had such a great time. Thank you.
Sure thing.